Good afternoon, shalom, and peace and blessings to all of you. My name is Sheila Boston, and I am the proud president of the New York City Bar Association, AKA the Bar of Hope. I am so pleased to welcome you to this program, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, critical and compelling lessons applicable to civil society and the legal community today. I wish to express my deep gratitude to Ambassador Ferit Hoxha, permanent representative of Albania to the United Nations, and to our other distinguished speakers for joining us for this very important program. Thanks as well to our United Nations Committee for producing and sponsoring the program, and our European Affairs and Foreign and Comparative Law Committee for co-sponsoring. I honestly cannot think of a time when it has been more important than right now, on this day and in this context, to honor the memory of the 6 million Jewish lives lost, viciously taken away, and to take to heart the lessons of the Holocaust so that it may never be repeated again. That's not only because fewer and fewer survivors remain alive to tell their stories each year, but also because the very act of remembrance is under attack as never before in my lifetime, at least. Remembrances, commemorations, memorials. These are collective activities in which people, in which communities focus on something that happened. More specifically, something we all agree happened. We cannot learn from history if we don't agree on what that history is. And we cannot count on the next generation to do the right thing if history cannot be taught properly in our schools. By now, you will have heard that the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel, Mouse, which depicts how its author's parents survived Auschwitz, has been banned by a school board because it contains swear words and a naked mouse. Where book banning takes place, are book burnings far behind? When I began my tenure as president of this association nearly 2 years ago, I named protection of the rule of law as one of the pillars of my presidency. That is one of the areas on which I thought the city bar should focus. Well, as we know, the rule of law and the achievement of justice depend on a common understanding of what the facts are and what the truth is. Lies, big and small, denial of reality, deliberate misinformation. These are all threats to the rule of law and the weapons used to deceive, gaslight, and brainwash people into joining mobs or remaining disinterested bystanders. And that puts us on the slippery slope to misery. And so today, in the face of all that, remembrance of crucial events is much more than just a nice little habitual thing we do at regular intervals on the calendar. No, it's more like an act of righteous defiance. We must always remember, because there will always be those who will work overtime to try to make us forget. In closing, I would like to mention another pillar of my presidency. It's near and dear to my heart now, especially with this pandemic. That is mental health and wellness. How traumatic it is, how demoralizing and debilitating for lies to abound and hatred to be so open and in such abundance today, even as we experience the trauma of a once-in-a-century global pandemic. But it's because of meetings just like this, where we convene people of goodwill from all around the world who share fundamental human values like the rule of law and equality and democracy. It's those reasons that I have nicknamed the New York City Bar Association the Bar of Hope. I believe that if we come together to unite, to speak up, stand up, to protect the rule of law, and yes, even to remember, fueled by the indignation that is the only rational human response to the outrageousness of our current affairs, can we move from helpless to hopeful and then be able to heal all together. Just being with all of you here right now, I have to say, I'm beginning to feel better already. And if I may invoke a quick sidebar, an important public service announcement, if you will, let me say this. If my words today ring true for you, and you wish to do something proactively to protect the rule of law and our democracy, then lawyers and law students, I urge, nay, I beg you, to please sign the Voting Rights Pledge on our City Bar homepage. We cannot afford to be silent in these troubling times. Our nation is at a crossroads, and it is up to each of us, lawyers, the professional problem solvers in society, to speak up and stand up for that which is right. Please sign our Voting Rights Pledge today. And now, it is my great pleasure to turn this marvelous program over to Sofia Murekatete, a member of our United Nations and European Affairs Committees. Thank you. God bless. Take it away, Sofia.
Thank you, Sheila. It's a hard act to follow. Very serious notes were pointed out. So thank you very much. I would like to introduce our opening speaker, Sami Steigmann, who was born at the prelude to the height of the Nazi Empire, and I will say in Chernivtsi, that's how we pronounce it, in Bukovina, part of the Austro-Hungary Empire, which then later became part of the Soviet Union and is part of Ukraine today. From 1941 through 1944, he was exiled with his parents to Ukraine at Mogilev-Podolsky, a labor camp in an area called Transnistria. And being too young to work, Sami was subjected to Nazi medical experimentation in his early years, but has no obvious recollection of those years. However, he still feels and really experiences the torment and the side effects every single day of his life of what happened to him. The camp was liberated by the Soviet Red Army, and his family was deported by the Romanians and not by the Germans. He grew up in Transylvania in a small town called Regin. In 1961, his whole family immigrated to Israel, where he served in the Israeli Air Force. And in 1968, without knowing English and with no money, Sami arrived on the purple shores of the United States of America, where he lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In 1983, he returned to Israel, but in 1988, he came back to the United States and choosing New York City as his place of residence. Sami established the Regina Nathan and Sami Steigmann Family Peace and Tolerance Education Fund, and the fund enables Sami to share his life experience with audiences all over the world. He's dedicated to teaching and reaching as many young people as he can, nationally and internationally, to promote tolerance. And on February 17, 2016, Sami was recognized for his life's work when he received the Harmony Power Award from the Museum of Tolerance in New York City. He also received a proclamation from the New York State Assembly recognizing him as an example of courage and compassion for his work, speaking with students and visitors to New York. This role that he plays currently, he did point out that he doesn't want sympathy, no tea and sympathy for him. He just wants to make sure that people understand that he survived and that his recollection bears the truth to what has happened during the Holocaust, but that he is resilient, as many people are. This is an educational tool to make sure that it never happens again. And I will just mention that we recently came out with a report on the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe on the European Affairs Committee side. It was called "The Rise of Anti-Semitism in Europe Could de facto again become de jure?" And it's a very profound report on what's happening. And I also have penned a report in 2018, which I shared with the New York City Bar in service to the International Committee. And that was on the rise of anti-Semitism plaguing Ukraine and the Russian propaganda machine. And that was penned for Human Rights First, which exposed anti-Semitism in Ukraine, which has been a historical issue and which was obviously widespread in the 20th century and now carried out by neo-Nazis in Ukraine and the C-14 gangs, which march across streets and claim that Mr. Bandera, who created atrocities and killed many Jews, sent them to slaughter, they claim him as a national hero. So in closing, I'll just comment that anti-Semitism obviously was first used in the late 1800s, and it indicated a discrimination against Jews on an ethnic rather than religious grounds. But the campaign of mass murder known as the Holocaust ended, which we would say ended with the Nazis. But anti-Semitism exists, and it rears its ugly head every day in Eastern Europe. If you read those reports that were disseminated, you would see that. Influencing governmental policies and creating legislation of Holocaust denial. And this is done to save the face of nationalists, which is disgraceful in the 21st century because it's a denial that cannot happen. It was obviously a historical fact. I emigrated from the Soviet Union as a refugee. My report also deals with the Roma population, 150,000, which were killed by the Nazis. 6 million Jews perished during the Holocaust, a known fact. Soviet Russia expelled all its Jews under President Leonid Brezhnev. I was one of them, and expelled the Romani population as well. I will point out that Soviet Russia discouraged the practice of Judaism and actually did not allow Jews to emigrate. So in closing, I will say that anti-Semitism is prevalent. It's obviously in America, the desecration of synagogues, Holocaust denial. I cannot, the recent Oprah, you know, what was said by Whoopi Goldberg, sorry. This is a horrendous trend, and I really hope that we can come together and avoid Kristallnacht, Babi Yar, and the horrors of Treblinka, and do not deny that something as obvious as the Holocaust happened. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce Clayton. Sorry, I became very emotional. I would like to introduce our intrepid co-chair of the United Nations Committee at the New York City Bar, Mr. Clayton Cheney. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, for that introduction. Before we begin, I wanted to thank members of the City Bar's United Nations Committee for their efforts in putting on this program, as well as the European Affairs Committee and the Foreign and Comparative Law Committee and the Anti-Defamation League, who are co-sponsoring this event. Lastly, I'd like to thank City Bar President Sheila Boston and the City Bar staff who worked tirelessly to put this event together. Without their support, it would not be possible for us to be here today. Throughout the program today, if anyone in the audience has a question for any of the speakers, please feel free to use the question and answer tab at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to allow the speakers to answer all the questions from the audience. We are here today to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was established through UN General Assembly Resolution 60/7, designating January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, Birkenau concentration camp, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I could not think of a more appropriate way to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day than to hear from Sami Steigmann, a truly inspirational figure who has dedicated his life's work to teaching others the lessons from the Holocaust and promoting tolerance among different communities. Sami, thank you so much for being here with us today. I know when we spoke before this event that you did not want to make your remarks about you or focus solely on yourself. But I think the audience would like to hear a little bit about your personal story and how it motivated you to teach young people about the Holocaust and the importance of tolerance.
First of all, good morning, everybody. I am extremely honored to be part with such distinguished people, especially with the ambassador, okay, to the UN from Albania. And hopefully you will tell them the story, okay, what Albania did, which very, very unusual. Very few people know about it. I have started to speak only in 2008. For 63 years, I felt that I don't belong to the Holocaust survivors because I have no memory of that from that period of time. For me, it's a blessing in disguise because I don't have to relive those horrors, okay, every single day like the older survivors. Additionally, until the Eichmann trial in 1961 in Israel, the Holocaust survivors felt guilty, ashamed, like victims, and they wanted the children to have a normal childhood. So they did not talk or burden the children with those horror stories. So number one, I felt I don't belong to the Holocaust survivors, but I felt I didn't belong to the children of the Holocaust survivors because most of them were born in the DP camps, displaced people. Those were the camps liberated by the Allies. Life was not easy. They had to be there for 3 to 5 years because they had no place to go. But there's one thing that was missing. and that is the threat of death did not exist. And there were two things, which I call them miracles. In Yiddish, I don't know if you heard it or not. If not, you will learn it today. It's called Basher, meant to be. And there were two miracles that happened that all of a sudden put me on the speaker circuit. As you probably know, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. closed its door to the general public for 2 days for 16 years prior to me being there. I've never been there. And they opened it up only to the Holocaust survivors, their children, their liberators. Don't ask me why. On November 1st and November 2nd, I decided to go. And there were over 8,000 people from all over the world. And at the table where I was sitting, I met a man born in the same city, been in the same camp, the same years, 1941, 1944. He was taken when he was 8 months old. I was taken when I was a year and a half. And this is the difference between history and living history. By meeting him, by being able to talk to him, all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I felt that I belonged to both generations. In 2007, I decided to join the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, the second largest Holocaust museum in the United States. And in 2008, I got my first assignment to speak to sixth graders. You are all speakers, and you probably will agree with me that your first presentation is not the best. It's not the most complete. I did not have a story. I did not know that I can tell a story. And I had no idea what impact I will have in such young people. Meant to be, Bashir, they sent me thank you letters, each one better than the other. But one sixth grader changed my life forever. She wrote, P.S., your story was overwhelming. And I promise I'll pass your story to my children. When I saw the impact that I had in such young people, my first presentation, I decided to dedicate the rest of my life to reach as many young people as I can, nationally and internationally. If you will ask any survivor, how come you're alive today? Everybody will use only one word, luck. There is no rhyme, there is no reason why somebody lived, somebody died. The only thing that I can say is that people that had faith, a number of them did survive, but people that had no faith whatsoever, a number of them committed suicide because the conditions were so dire. The interesting thing that I want to say is that, like Clayton said, I started last year for the first time to do something to be different than all the other survivors. I realized that young people, the young generation, they are totally clueless how Holocaust and genocide started. They started the same way. They started with words. And if we have time, I will tell you the story. But the interesting part is my main focus has become, to teach the young people about history, how it started, how is it possible that ordinary German people, ordinary people from Europe, from former Soviet Union, from other countries, found that not only acceptable, but required to annihilate one group of people, of the Jewish people. It did not happen suddenly. It went step by step. And by teaching the young people the history of the Holocaust and genocide, I wanted to be able to recognize the signs of today that can lead to other tragedies and learn how to prevent them. And the most important thing is I use an acronym for a Hebrew word called emet. That is truth. And this is to educate the next generation, to motivate them, because I'm also a motivational speaker, to motivate them to be the best that they can be, to empower them to become upstanders, because all the tragedies, genocide and Holocaust, happened because the world stood by and did nothing. And the other thing is, I want to teach them about tolerance. Tolerance means different things for different people. For me, it is accepting other people's opinion, other people's culture. I can summarize it with one word, and that's respect. Respect for oneself, respect for other people. And when I go into the history, I also spend a lot of time in making the connection between the state of Israel and the Holocaust. So what I'm saying is that during the Holocaust, Jews died because we did not have a country. Okay, and Yom HaZikaron, which is the National Memorial Day, we remember people that died for us to have a country. I also try to teach them the importance of the state of Israel for the Jews in diaspora. And I'm certain that you know, in 2015, because of the rampant violence that happened in France, 8,500 French Jews, okay, made Aliyah, decided to go to Israel to find a safe haven. And finally, okay, and then if you want, I will tell you about myself a little bit more, but finally, it's very important to use the proper words. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda under Hitler, said something that we have to remember, and it's actual even today. A lie told long enough becomes truth. And I can give examples in the United States. Our leaders use the wrong words, perpetuating false narratives, including Jewish leaders. And the other thing that I can tell about Israel, but I want to give only one example. A lot of people are using indiscriminately the word Nazi. There are no Nazis anywhere in the world. There are people of today that believe in the Nazi ideology. And we should use the proper word, neo-Nazi. When you're using the word Nazi, we are talking about the past. When you're using the word neo-Nazi, we are talking about the present. So words have meaning, and words lead to action, good and bad. So you have to be extremely careful. And you know what happened recently, okay? Okay, but all I'm saying is words are very, very important, especially the leaders, celebrities. They have to use the proper words, because otherwise, okay, they perpetuate false narratives, because the young generation, they don't do the research, they use slogans and they go with it, and it becomes a fact. I'll stop here for now, and if you can guide me.
Thanks so much, Sami. I did want to, I'm glad that you were able to touch on all those points. I know from your website and from different presentations you've given, often your remarks discuss the principles of never being a perpetrator, never being a victim through speaking up, and never being a bystander. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those principles and the importance of them.
Yeah. Okay, one of the things I teach the young people to understand that the brains, okay, is like a computer. I don't know if any one of you are probably too young to remember when the IBM came in the first time. So there was a saying, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So what I'm saying is everything starts the way you think, even subconsciously. Okay, but if you think positive, you will use positive words. Positive words will lead to a positive attitude. That will lead to positive experiences and to a happier life. For me, it is very important for the young people to learn that. I'll just give an example. It's a little bit strange, but I was under a heavy sedation. And when I woke up, my ex said that I said something about her mother. I said, me? Never. But guess what? When I was alone, I started to smile. That was exactly what I was thinking, which I would never dare to say it. And I want also the young people to understand something very important. Okay, as a bystander, okay, whether they know it or they don't know it, they are part of the problem. Because as a bystander, you are not going to help the victim, you are helping the oppressor. As an upstander, okay, standing up to injustice, standing up, you know, when somebody tells a lie or misinformation or whatever it is, okay, you become, okay, and they become, okay, part of the solution. And that's what we need. Unlike many other people of my generation, with everything that is happening today, I still believe in the young generation, in the next generation, and I am convinced, okay, that by teaching them the proper thing, they will make a difference. They will make it a better world and a kinder world. I've always been an optimist, and I will die an optimist.
So I know you alluded to some of the challenges that you faced in your life following the Holocaust, and you know I think it would be great if you could kind of discuss that a little bit, and you know the importance of providing a voice to survivors of the Holocaust, not just of the Holocaust, but also of other genocides and mass atrocities.
When I tell some of the challenges that I went through, I don't want the young people or anybody for that matter to feel sorry for me. But I just wanted to learn that under no circumstances should they ever give up, should they ever lose hope. Okay, and my motto in life is, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to be. And within my means, I choose to be a happy person. Number one, 1956, no, in 1996, at age 56, I became homeless. I am not a street person, and I tried to commit suicide. Okay. Thank God I didn't do it, but I was in a shelter. Okay, so I've seen another part of the world, and my beginning of recovery happened with something very interesting. I've always had a strong willpower, but at this time, it was the first time in my life that I was a broken man. And I was an extremely heavy smoker, chain smoker, I think 2.5 packs a day. So I said to myself, when I will quit smoking, cold turkey, I will recover. I did not say I will try. That's not a commitment. I said, I will. December 13th, if you are superstitious, Friday the 13th of 1996, I had my last cigarette. And that was, okay, the first road. It was a test for me that I do want to live. The other challenge that I recovered from it by volunteering. And in my opinion, United States is the only country in the world that volunteering is part of our DNA. And whether they know it or not, by volunteering, you will always volunteer for something that you like. By volunteering, by helping other people, you are actually helping yourself. That was in my particular case. And if you want, I can give you examples. But the other thing is being homeless. Okay, I live today, and I'm 1/3 of the Holocaust survivors in the United States that lives under the poverty line. My total monthly income is $1,393, okay? And I still smile in the most expensive city in the country. So I want them to take example from me. The other challenge that I had to overcome is I have a son. I have 2 grandchildren, and he does not allow me to be in touch with them. So a lot of people, when they are in the same situation, they don't want to hear stories about their grandchildren. I'm always interested, and I'm happy for other people that they have a relationship. But the interesting part is, how did I deal with it to remain a happy person and not to live in the past, to be angry, to be revengeful? So the interesting part is that all of us have a want and a need. A want, if it happens, fine. If it doesn't happen, no big deal. My want, don't ask me why I want to go to Australia. If it happens, fine. If not, no big deal. But I have a need, and need must be fulfilled. And my need is to teach and to share. So every time I am giving a presentation, especially for the young people, whether they know it or not, they become my substitute grandchildren, and my need is fulfilled. And I was so happy when I received letters from fourth graders saying, I'm so happy that for 2 hours I was able to be your grandchild. So we always, there is a saying, the journey for 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And I'm saying what happened yesterday is gone. There is nothing you can do about it, okay? No sense in dwelling on it. Remember, tomorrow is a new day. It's a new beginning. It's a fresh day, okay? And that allows me, and that's what I'm trying to teach other people, always to move forward, not to be stuck in the past.
Sami, thank you for those inspirational words. You know, I wish we had more time to let you go on, but we have to allow everybody else a chance to say their remarks as well. But you know, I do hope that you'll be able to stay on with us, and if there's any questions from the audience, that you know, I'll certainly pose them to you. But you know, there's many important life lessons in the words that you just shared with us. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment, if I
certainly.
may.
Certainly.
Okay, I just forgot. I also teach the young people not to stereotype. My life was saved by a German woman. Not far away from the camp, there was a farm owned by Germans, and she brought food to the guards in the SS. Obviously, she had access to the camp. After the medical experiments, there came a time that I was dying of starvation. A lot of people in labor camps and other places, they died through attrition, okay? Beaten to death, worked to death, okay, shot, randomly starved to death. But there are physical signs when somebody dies of starvation: big head, swollen stomach, swollen feet. And here's a German woman, so a strange kid, not risking only her own life, which is relatively easy. She risked the life of her entire family by giving me milk. I do not know her name, and I was unable to honor her in person or posthumously. However, in 2014, I was in Israel to give testimony at Yad Vashem. And next to the museum, there is a garden honoring 27,000 non-Jewish people that saved Jews. And I saw a marker honoring the unknown, righteous among the nations. And I was very happy because indirectly, the woman that saved my life has been recognized.
Thank you, Sami. We're humbled that you were able to join us today to share that story with us. So thank you so much. I'd like to now turn to the panel of speakers, which is really an incredible lineup of speakers who will discuss a range of issues pertaining to the Holocaust, the rise of anti-Semitism, and efforts to prevent religious hatred and mass atrocities. Today we are joined by Ambassador Ferit Hoxha, Jacqueline Murekatete, Lauren Krapf, Owen Pell, and Rabbi Mark Wilds. Thank you all for being here. Ambassador Hoxha, I wanted to turn to you first, but please allow me to provide a brief introduction. Ambassador Hoxha joined the Albanian Foreign Service in 1991 and has been active in foreign affairs and international relations since. In 1995, he was counselor of the mission of Albania to the United Nations in New York. From 1998 to 2001, he was the ambassador to the European Union, including to Belgium, and non-resident to Luxembourg. From 2001 to 2006, he was ambassador to France, including non-resident to Portugal, Algeria, and Monaco. Between 2006 and 2009, he served as the Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the highest civil service position at the headquarters. From 2009 to 2015, he was the Albanian ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations and Albania's non-resident ambassador to Cuba. From 2015 to 2018, he was the Director General for Political and Strategic Issues at the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania. Between 2018 and 2021, he served as ambassador and permanent delegate of Albania to UNESCO. And in 2021, he was appointed as the ambassador and permanent representative of Albania to the United Nations. Welcome, Ambassador Hoxha, and thank you for being here. I was hoping that you could discuss the issue of the rising trend of anti-Semitism in Europe that we are seeing, as well as Albania's response to this trend. And additionally, if you could discuss a little bit about the efforts at the United Nations to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of religious bigotry. I believe you're on mute, Ambassador. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Clayton, for this introduction, and I'm extremely happy to be with you. Thank you for admitting me into this panel. It's an honor for me to have to share some thoughts about this extremely important topic, the rise of anti-Semitism, which is absolutely very worrying in Europe, but also elsewhere, and share some thoughts also on what is being done in Europe, but also at the United Nations. And as you mentioned, I'm a comeback kid. I have been at the United Nations, but I came back also to lead the Albanian team at the Security Council. Albania is serving since January at the Security Council, and I'm honored to be leading a very strong team and working with other countries on many issues, but also on this directly or indirectly. So I'm pleased to, and thank you, Sheila, for the kind words, and Sami for your very kind and warm words. And I'm pleased to join the bar of hope and share these ideas with you. Despite progress, international legal framework to prevent and address the use of hate speech in general remains very weak, and especially on the internet. But on this, Lauren will talk more about it. There is worryingly and widespread misuse with a disturbing presence and spread of hate speech, anti-Semitism, glorification of criminals, genocide denial, all kinds of inflammatory rhetorics, incitement to violence, conspiracy theories, and so on, with a proven adverse effect on social cohesion, the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And of course, in some cases, it can also lead to conflict. Out of all this, anti-Semitism is one of the most worrying aspects. It has to do with security for individuals, for communities in regions across the world, and remains a driving force of a range of violent extremist ideologies. And Sophia mentioned how anti-Semitism has been developed before, and unfortunately remains still very active and on the rise after even 75 years after the Holocaust. So it's like all forms of intolerance and discrimination, anti-Semitism has a profound impact on the whole society, undermining democratic values and human rights. In recent years, the changing geopolitical climate and media environment have led to a situation where open anti-Semitism is no longer confined to just extremist circles. It's, I mean, the world's oldest hatred, as it is rightly and justly called, has become increasingly mainstream. Therefore, this threat is no longer only addressed to Jews, it targets, what I would say, the very fabric of democratic societies. In the time that you have graciously provided to me, I would like to address three main issues, and then, of course, at the end, speak just a little bit about the Albanian story with the Jews during the Holocaust, because it's very particular and dear to us. First issue, a reality check on today's anti-Semitism in Europe. There is no doubt. Anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, including Holocaust denial, genocide denials, and glorification of war criminals in Europe and elsewhere has dramatically increased. A rabbi is attacked in the street. A synagogue or a Jewish cemetery is topped by a swastika. Hate is shouted from a loudspeaker in a Jewish neighborhood, or public rallies. And I don't understand how public rallies against COVID-19 restriction turn quickly into what, as if it were normal, into anti-Semitic acts. So what is wrong? A lot is wrong. A study commissioned by the European Commission and conducted by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, ISD, comparing the first 2 months of 2020 with the first 2 months of 2021 shows a 7-fold increase in anti-Semitic content on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram in French, and over a 13-fold increase in anti-Semitic content in German. Anti-Semitic content in French on Facebook was also engaged with through likes, comments, and shares over 500,000 times between 1 January 2020 and March 2021. So it's very, very worrying. Content in French received over 3 million retweets and likes on Twitter. Anti-Semitic content in German on Telegram was viewed over 2 billion times in the same period. 2 billion times, that's absolutely staggering. The same study also found a proliferation of gray area beyond what I mentioned, a gray area content which likely did not contravene legal thresholds around hate speech or Holocaust denial in France or Germany, but which nonetheless has the potential to be harmful. This dramatic surge needs to be addressed immediately and properly. We know that extremism thrives always on the bed of indifference. We cannot put ourselves on hold, hoping that things will naturally take their course and improve and so on. If political actors, media, civil society, education do not take responsibility, then inadvertently we are unfortunately encouraging, by our inability to act or our unwillingness to act or our indifference, we are encouraging such despicable acts and behaviors. So this must be a no-go. My second point is what is being done, how much is being done, and what we can do more. So I'm very happy to say that while this issue has been raised here and there and efforts have been made, a fantastic effort has been made lately by the European Commission on behalf of the member states. And in the beginning of October, I think the 5th of October last year, the European Commission unveiled its first EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, which seeks to place the European Union in the lead in the global fight against Jew hatred, against anti-Semitism, against hate speech and everything related to that. The European Commission's ultimate goal seems to be nothing less than an EU free from anti-Semitism. This is a bold goal, and I think we should applaud that. With the strategy centered around preventing and combating all forms of anti-Semitism, protecting and fostering Jewish life in the EU as well as in education, research and Holocaust remembrance. And the main theme is Europe can only prosper when its Jewish communities prosper too. So, and this is a very powerful statement. The strategy aims at tackling anti-Semitism, whether it originates from the far right, the far left, or mainstream society by Islamists and all other forms, and clearly identifies also one important thing. It is the Israel-related anti-Semitism, which also is a major problem. As the European Commission notes, it is in fact the most common form of anti-Semitism encountered online by Jews in Europe today. So through concrete measures, the strategy emphasizes the need for a comprehensive response to tackle the fight against anti-Semitism systematically into consideration when developing policies, legislation, funding programs, by mainstreaming the prevention and countering of anti-Semitism in all forms across the policy areas. Among the key recommendations for EU member states are the adoption and the use of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which also addresses what I mentioned, the Israeli-related anti-Semitism. I find it very important that for the first time, fight against anti-Semitism becomes also a pillar of foreign policy dimension in European politics. This includes promotion and full compliance of education material with UNESCO standards, and I will come back to that in a while. Ensure that EU external funds will not be misused to help incitement and violence against Jews, and by taking the lead in combating anti-Semitic incitement everywhere, anywhere, including the Middle Eastern societies, Europe can make a crucial contribution to the goal of it. And this is what they have as a possession, this two-state solution and enlarging the circle of peace through the Abraham Accords. So I will not mention specific measures because the report is very rich, but I would like to point just 2 out of them. The EU delegations will include reporting of anti-Semitic incidents in non-EU countries in their regular political reporting, and this is very important. And the second is fostering links between the Jewish tradition of planting trees on the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, including by school children, and that's very important. And of course, the link of that tradition with the EU pledge to plant 3 billion additional trees under the biodiversity and forest strategy for 2030, thereby raising mutual awareness and visibility, and this is very much needed. So my third point, very quickly, what should be done, more should be done to deal with this problem? There is no doubt that the measures the EU is taking respond to an immediate and pressing need. 2 weeks ago, the United Nations General Assembly, I'm sure you know that, adopted a resolution on Holocaust denial and distortion, a landmark test adopted by consensus, and that's very important, as a necessary reminder that more needs to be done, and most importantly, continuously. But this, okay, texts are there, resolutions are there, the real work is done in practice on the field. I remain convinced that we should invest more in education, and Sami mentioned, and it was heartening to listen to him act as an educator. But I think it should start at early education to make sure that anti-Semitism as a problem is recognized and addressed internationally, building capacity of education system everywhere to address anti-Semitism, to address conspiracy theories and all forms of hate speech, and by increased investment in social cohesion. At the time when anti-Semitism is on the rise, the IHRA definition becomes crucial. It should be adopted widely. More efforts must be done in this respect, and as my country, Albania, is concerned, in October 2020, the Albanian parliament adopted a resolution and endorsed the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, and of course, joined the global efforts to combat anti-Semitism. Now, my last point, I would not end without saying a few words about the situation in my own country in general. And of course, I come from a country in Europe, not a European Union member country yet, but still looking to open negotiations of accession. And when it comes to Jews, tolerance and respect for others, we have a particular story to tell. There were thousands of individuals, thankfully, who helped the Jews at the darkest time in history. There were a handful of countries who stood up on the right side when the world was falling. But there was one single country that brought these 3 facts, meaningful facts together, and I will mention them. The entire community of Jews in Albania, those residents or those who were traveling to seek place in Albania or elsewhere, they all were saved. There is not a single person that was handed to the Nazis, and Albania was occupied by the Nazis, despite numerous requests and continued pressure on everyone, including the authorities at that time. Jews were hidden, provided Albanian names, false documents, and always protected at the risk of the lives of those who did so. And then the last one, and Sami mentioned at the beginning, the number of Jews in Albania after the war was 10 times higher than before. Albania was a sanctuary, a Garden of Eden for the Jews. Now, we are implementing a proactive approach on historic awareness of Holocaust and the promotion of values of tolerance and peaceful existence, which is extremely important for my country, which is composed of different religious communities. This is reflected in the history of textbooks and training courses and extracurricular activities. Students encounter Holocaust issues at the age of 13, but awareness is further developed within the history curriculum of primary and secondary levels of school. At the National Historic Museum in Albania, in Tirana, the capital, a pavilion is dedicated to rescue the Albanian Jews during the Holocaust. A dedicated museum on Jewish history is being created, and plans are on the way for opening a Jewish center in Tirana. Just to mention a couple of important steps, just that the history of Jews is the history of mankind, and it has to be known, it has to be there, it has to be visible, and it has to be all part of daily activities. So let me end with these words. Albania has no history of anti-Semitism. It has no experience of hatred of the other, of disrespect of difference. To the contrary, various religious communities have lived together through centuries, together, convinced that respect makes the society stronger and better, not just for some, but for all. And with this, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And it's personally for me great to learn about the the story of Albania during the Holocaust. That's something that I didn't personally know about, and it's why we have these webinars. It's so we can learn about these things. So thank you so much, Jacqueline. If I can, I'd like to turn to you now. Jacqueline Murekatete is an internationally recognized genocide survivor and human rights activist. Born in Rwanda, Jacqueline was 9 years old when she lost her parents, all 6 siblings, and most of her extended family to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Jacqueline was inspired to share her story of survival and hope for the first time in 2001 after listening to the story of the late Holocaust survivor, David Gwertzman, who became a dear friend and mentor. Since then, Jacqueline has delivered hundreds of genocide prevention and human rights presentations at schools, NGO events, and faith-based communities across the US and in Germany, Israel, Ireland, Bosnia, and Belgium. She has also addressed the UN General Assembly and regularly participates in high-level human rights conferences. For her work, Jacqueline has received a number of prestigious awards, including the Global Peace and Tolerance Award from Friends of the United Nations, the Moral Courage Award from the American Jewish Committee, the Do Something Award from Do Something, the K Family Award from the Anti-Defamation League, the Mbuto Foundation Celebrating Young Rwandan Achievers Award from the First Lady of Rwanda, and the Ellis Island Medals of Honor Award from the National Ethnic Coalition, which put her name in the US congressional record. Jacqueline founded the Genocide Survivors Foundation as a vehicle to continue her genocide prevention efforts and raise support for fellow genocide survivors. She has a BA in politics from New York University and a JD from Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. Thank you for being with us today, Jacqueline. I'd like to give you a chance to tell us about your personal story as a survivor of genocide. And additionally, if you could discuss the importance of providing a voice to and support to survivors of genocide and other mass atrocities.
Thank you so much, Clayton. Good afternoon, everyone. I also want to begin by saying how honored I am to be here with you today as we commemorate the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As you heard from Clayton, my own activism, my own genocide prevention activism was inspired after I had a chance to meet a Holocaust survivor by the name of David Gwertzman. And this was after I had a chance to read a book called Night by Elie Wiesel when I was a sophomore in New York City. And David and I spent more than a decade traveling around this country and outside this country and sharing our experiences, him during the Holocaust and myself during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Not because we enjoyed having to repeat the horrors that we witnessed or the pain and suffering that we experienced, but because David and I, as well as other Holocaust and genocide survivors who speak today, feel very much committed to making sure that what happened to us, that the crime of genocide is not a crime that continues to take place. So I'm going to focus my remarks, as Clayton said, on the urgent need to provide critical services to survivors of the Holocaust and as well as survivors of the other genocides that have taken place in the aftermath of the Holocaust. But I want to begin by just giving a little bit background on my own experience during the genocide in Rwanda. When the genocide began in April of 1994, I went from being a relatively happy child with both parents, with 4 brothers and 2 sisters, to finding myself in an environment where I was forced to leave my home and everything that I had ever known and loved behind if I had any chance of surviving. And during the approximately 100 days of genocide, I found myself in an environment where I was exposed to horrors that no child, really anybody, should ever have to experience. I saw family members being murdered around me for no reason than their Tutsi ethnicity. And I lived in an environment where each day when I got up, I did not know whether I was going to leave to see the next day. Many times, like all survivors, I came face to face with people, with Hutu neighbors, who were seeking to take my life. Again, not because of any crime that I had committed, but simply because of my Tutsi ethnicity, something that I had no choice in being. And while I was one of those few who survived the genocide, after the genocide, I'll come to learn, as you heard, that my parents, all my 6 siblings, most of my extended family and friends had not been as lucky, that they were among the over 1 million people who were systematically murdered in those 100 days. In regards to my immediate family, I will come to learn that one day during the genocide, my Hutu neighbors, people whose children I grew up playing with, people whose children I grew up going to school with, going to church with, people who used to come to my house for dinner, people who we spent a lot of time together with different weddings, child naming ceremonies, that these people had taken my parents, my 4 brothers and 2 sisters, and all the Tutsis in my village to a nearby river where they proceeded to murder them one by one and to throw their bodies into that same river. For me and other survivors in that village, we were deprived of even the opportunity to be able to bury our families, to give them a proper burial. This is something that many survivors struggle with today. In 1994, the goal was not only to exterminate Tutsis and anybody else who was against the extermination plan, but it was also to erase any evidence that a genocide was taking place. As a result, the victims were often thrown in rivers, in latrines, in mass graves. And today, many survivors live with the trauma of not even knowing where their families made their ultimate end. Today, as many of you know, it's almost 28 years since the genocide against the Tutsi took place. And since the genocide, we know that many investigative journalists have exposed the fact that what happened in Rwanda in 1994 is a genocide that was committed against the Tutsi ethnic group. It's also a genocide that could have been prevented. In fact, the genocide against the Tutsi is often referred to in many circles as a preventable genocide because there was enough warnings that the genocide was about to happen. There were enough means, both on the part of this country and many countries around the world, to prevent the genocide. But as it is the case with other genocides, there was simply no political will to prevent the genocide. And as a result of that, over 1 million people, including my entire immediate family and most of my extended family, were murdered, as I mentioned. Since the genocide, there have been many apologies by many world leaders, many head of states, including President Bill Clinton, who was president at the time of the genocide. But unfortunately, you find that these apologies have often been empty apologies, in a sense that they have not been accompanied by services, by support to help survivors rebuild their shattered lives. The failure to provide adequate support and services to survivors is not only true in the case of Rwanda, in the case of the Holocaust survivors, but it is also true in other post-genocide environments. What we have seen so far is that a genocide happens, the international community fails to prevent the genocide, head of states or some head of states make apologies, but there is really no real commitment to make sure that those who survived are provided with the services and support they need to rebuild. To be sure, I have to acknowledge that a number of countries, whether it's Rwanda, Israel, Germany, UK, have provided some support to survivors in Rwanda, generally under the larger umbrella of peace building efforts. It is also true that some NGOs have provided some support. But what I'm here to stress this morning is that, unfortunately, adequate support has not been provided, and the facts speak for themselves. For example, just recently, last week on January 27th, as we were commemorating the International Day, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, I read 2 articles that deeply troubled me. And I'm going to cite some of the things that I read. The first article, which was published by the Times of Israel and republished by CBS NewsHour and other media outlets, stated that roughly 1 in 3 Holocaust survivors in Israel are living in poverty. On the same day, January 27, a second article, which was published in CNN opinion section and was written by Mark Wolf, a child of Holocaust survivors, who is also the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Federations of North America, stated that 1/3 of Holocaust survivors living here in the US also live in poverty. And this is something that is deeply troubling, especially considering that we are here decades after the Holocaust, and especially considering that many Holocaust survivors today are in their 80s and 90s. Unfortunately, as mentioned before, this is something you see across the board within different survivors communities. At Genocide Survivors Foundation, the organization that I founded a few years ago and that I run today, we are often overwhelmed by calls from different genocide survivors who are in need of basic services like proper housing, food, funds to be able to pay their children's school fees, to pay for transportation, electric bills, and so forth. In the aftermath of the genocide and mass atrocities, there seems to be a troubling cycle. Generally, right after the genocide, there's usually empathy, there's usually a lot of relief that is provided. But within just months or a couple of years after that, the world usually turns away, usually turns a blind eye and runs to focus on the next fire. Today, there's an adequate commitment on the parts of states and international community to truly make sure that survivors of genocide receive the type of critical services that they need and deserve. It is critical to realize that just as the crime of genocide does not happen overnight, as Sami reminded us at the beginning of this program, it's also important to realize that the consequences of genocide, the impact of genocide, particularly on the lives of survivors, is long-term and enduring. But with enough targeted and specific funding that recognizes survivors' unique experience as a result of them being genocide survivors, I believe that survivors will not only continue to struggle to survive, but they will thrive, as many examples show. In one of the articles that I mentioned before, that was published by CNN and written by Mark Wolf, he states that we must insist that survivors of the Holocaust, and here I can add survivors of other genocides, who are our heroes and our teachers, are treated responsibly with the dignity and respect that they deserve. I could not agree more. In the end, I truly believe that we have a moral responsibility to help Holocaust survivors and genocide survivors who are so vulnerable to be able to live secure lives and to live the rest of their lives with dignity. We know that during the Holocaust and during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, survivors were victimized in the worst way possible. They were betrayed on every level, and they were abandoned by the international community. And I believe that today, failing or falling short of giving survivors enough support necessary for them to live secure, healthy, and happy lives re-victimizes them. It betrays them once again, and it abandons them twice. One of the best ways that we can truly honor the memory of the victims of the Holocaust and subsequent genocides is by making sure that their surviving widows, orphans, and other family members get access to the critical services that they need and deserve. So in the end, I want to end my remarks by asking all of you to join me in this effort, in this advocacy effort, to make sure that survivors get the support that they need. I believe that this is not only morally the right thing to do, but it is an essential component of the work of genocide prevention. Because for those of us who have had a chance to listen to a Holocaust survivor or genocide survivor speak, we know that there's nothing more powerful than a survivor testimony in helping the audience to understand the horrors of the Holocaust, the horrors of genocide. Many survivors, myself included, believe that we must be at the forefront in this work of trying to prevent future genocides. But for many survivors, this is not a luxury that they have, because many of them are still living in an environment where they have to struggle to get access to basic services, as I said, like proper housing, food, access to education, and healthcare services, both physical and services that are needed to help them deal with their trauma suffered as a result of the genocide. So supporting survivors of genocide ensures that more survivors are able to share their experiences, and it amplifies survivors' voices in the work of genocide prevention, which is very critical. So today, as we gather here to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, I'd like to end by calling on each and every one of you to do your part in supporting vulnerable Holocaust and genocide survivors. But how can you do this? I want to suggest just two ways. One is by teaming up or supporting local Holocaust and genocide survivors organizations that are providing services to these vulnerable survivors. I want to mention just two organizations here in New York City, which provide services, critical services to aging Holocaust survivors who are struggling here in the US. There's a Blue Card, an organization called the Blue Card, which some of you may be familiar with. Another organization which I recently had the opportunity to know, called Self-Help. So I encourage all of you to look up the Blue Card and Self-Help as organizations that help aging Holocaust survivors here in New York City who need some support. And for those of you who are interested in supporting survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and other genocides, I certainly encourage you to look us up, Genocide Survivors Foundation. You can visit our website. You can reach out to Clayton after the program and get my contact information, and hopefully get involved in helping us with the work that we're trying to do to support survivors and to serve as advocates on their behalf. So that is one thing that you can do, is be engaged with the organizations that are actually providing support. The second way that you can help us in this work is by calling on local city, state government officials to provide more targeted and specific funding for Holocaust and genocide survivors. This is something that has shown a number of success. For example, a few years ago, as a result of lobbying and pressuring, the New York City Council established an initiative, which is now called the Elie Wiesel Holocaust Survivors Initiative, And this initiative provides Holocaust survivors here in New York City who live below the federal poverty line with critical services that they need. And this initiative resulted from advocacy by a number of Jewish organizations and Holocaust museums. So I do believe that with enough pressure, with enough lobbying, we can pressure city, states, and different countries to actually invest and allocate, again, specific funding to local survivors organizations and to make sure that survivors are able to live the rest of their lives in security and with dignity. I do believe this is, again, not only a moral responsibility, but it is an essential part in the work of genocide prevention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for those powerful remarks. And it's heartening to hear that your organization and the work of other organizations to fill the void of providing, lasting services to not only Holocaust survivors, but survivors of other genocides and mass atrocities. So thank you so much for your work. Lauren, if I can turn to you now. Lauren Krapf serves as the Anti-Defamation League's Counsel for Technology Policy and Advocacy, leading strategy and operations for ADL's initiatives to fight online hate, hold big tech accountable, and protect targets of digital harassment. Prior to joining ADL, Lauren worked as an attorney in Los Angeles, where she managed trial and appellate litigation and advised employers about issues and policies related to workplace harassment prevention. Lauren was an Ernie Pyle Scholar at Indiana University and chief note and comment editor of the International Law Review at Loyola Law School. She is currently pursuing a master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Social Policy and Practice. In 2020, Lauren was selected as one of New York Jewish Week's 36 under 36. In 2021, her work at ADL won honorable mention in Fast Company magazine's World Changing Ideas Awards. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this event, Lauren. I was hoping that you could discuss the proliferation of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate speech in online forums, including in social media websites, and how this can fuel real-world extremism and violence. And furthermore, it'd be great to hear about the efforts by the ADL to combat online hate speech and extremism.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Clayton, for having me, and thanks to all of the other esteemed panelists doing such important work. I'm really, truly grateful to be here among all of you. As Clayton mentioned, I'm going to concentrate my remarks on online hate speech and anti-Semitism, and specifically focus on social media's role and how we can and should hold platforms accountable. To back up a little bit, the Anti-Defamation League was founded in 1913, and for 100+ years, we've been striving for the same mission: to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. We've been fighting hate in all forms for this time, and we have the understanding that where people go, hate follows, and that includes online. That's why in the early days of dial-up, ADL anticipated the ways in which hate speech could poison the internet and could really impact all of us. In the 1990s and 2000s, ADL invested time and resources to communicate with key players in the tech industry. At the time, the priorities were to make sure that there were clear and understandable terms of service about hate speech on these platforms, and to ensure that platforms were enforcing these policies aggressively. Well, we've seen the way that the internet has impacted all of our lives, for better and for worse, and really has become foundational to the way that we work, live, learn, pray, and socialize. In 2017, we doubled down on our efforts to protect individuals online and launched the Center for Technology and Society. And the CTS, as we call it, is a leader in the global fight against online hate and harassment. We have engineers, policy experts, and researchers all working to ensure that we protect victims and targets of harassment. We call out tech companies or call in tech companies to work with them to ensure that individuals can have a safe and equitable place to be online. And unfortunately, online hate and harassment is incredibly concerning. It was years ago, But over the last several years, as the CTS has engaged in consistent data collection, we've seen the numbers are staggering. Our latest data shows that 41% of Americans experience online harassment. 27%, nearly a third, experience severe harassment. That's physical threats, stalking, doxing, and swatting, which are other forms of digital abuse. But importantly, the reason why this is such a foundational issue to the Anti-Defamation League is that 1 in 3 individuals who are harassed online attribute that harassment to their identity characteristics. So people aren't just being harassed online, though that would be problematic for simply existing online. They're being harassed online because of who they are, who they love, what they look like, and how they pray. 36% of Jewish people experienced online harassment in 2020 to 2021, 64% of LGBTQ individuals, 46% of Muslim, 33% of Black respondents, 21% of Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So again, individuals are being targeted online because of these characteristics. But how can we protect these targets? Oftentimes when we think about these issues in online spaces, questions around the First Amendment and protected speech come into play. But what we argue is there's a lot more nuance, and amongst a group of lawyers, I think that we can really hone in on the fact that while there's protected speech online, there's also unprotected speech online. There's also conduct that is engaged in online that is not speech. As I mentioned before, nearly a third of individuals experience severe harassment. Nearly 20% experience physical threats online. More than 1 in 10 experience stalking. These are behaviors that are unlawful, that go beyond the protections of the First Amendment. That's why ADL has engaged in an effort across the country to update our laws on the books state by state and at the federal level to ensure that different forms of cyber harassment, such as doxing, which is putting someone's information online with the intent that it be used to harm that individual, or swatting, which is calling in a false emergency to draw an aggressive emergency response unit to someone's dwelling without completely unbeknownst to them, without them knowing, often creating confusion and even resulting in fatality, to update laws like cyber stalking. That's a key area where ADL sees an opportunity for us to be more proactive in understanding what our world is today and how individuals are experiencing harm. But when we think about the First Amendment and we think about protected speech, again, in this group, I don't have to say it, but it bears repeating, is the First Amendment is meant to restrict our government from encroaching on our speech protections. Platforms are private companies, just like other private companies. They can create rules to ensure that their environment aligns with their ethos. And that's why we do think still, just as we did in the 90s and 2000s, that having robust policies to protect against hate speech and harassment, whether protected or unprotected technically by the First Amendment, is so incredibly important. Here, platform accountability is a serious problem. And that's why not only is ADL focusing on protecting victims and targets individually, but also increasing platform accountability in this effort. Our data from the same survey that I mentioned before found that 75% of individuals who experienced harassment online experienced at least some of that harassment on Facebook, 75%. 41% of individuals who experienced physical threats on social media platforms and reported them said that the platform did not do anything with that report and that content remained up. So in this way, it's really important that we focus on the impact that social media platforms, engagement and interaction has on individuals. And I'll also talk about the impact that it has writ large and the ability for online hate and harassment, bigotry and violence to absolutely go offline. One of the areas that I actually want to share with you, a visual aid where CTS, our Center for Technology and Society, has been focusing on are how platforms can not only have strong policies, but also consistently enforce those policies to protect users. And in that way, just this past year, the CTS generated scorecards to stress test how platforms were doing when it came to anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial on their platform interfaces. So I'm going to share my screen briefly. and show you the results of this project. If you can see over here, unfortunately, the results, yet unsurprisingly, were not great. We looked at platforms like Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, Twitch, and saw, do they have a policy related to anti-Semitism? If someone reported anti-Semitism on the platform, was there a response within 24 to 72 hours? Was somebody notified of the reason why, if there was no enforcement, that decision was made? Or if there was enforcement, why that decision was made? That I'll note across the board, there's no notification for individuals who are either targeted or who are viewing harassment, especially specifically here focused on anti-Semitism, no notification as to what the platform's decisions were. ADL is also a trusted flagger. I note that if anybody is experiencing this form of digital abuse online, please reach out to ADL. You can go to adl.org/report-incident. And we saw, whether when through regular means or through our program, was there any sort of difference? So the anti-Semitism scorecard, it's on our website. It shows, no one here has gotten an A. We have some B's, C's, and 1 D. Unfortunately, the Holocaust denial scorecard is even more bleak. And what we have found is ADL had been advocating for years, specifically on Facebook, but also across all platforms, that Holocaust denial not be considered misinformation, but be considered hate and hate speech, because we all agree that the Holocaust happened, and we all know that the impact of Holocaust denial is far more than misinformation. And then we know that platforms treat misinformation and hate differently. And we think it's incredibly important that Holocaust denial be considered a form of targeted hate. Well, we looked, is there an explicit policy? Was it under their general hate policy? Thankfully, by the time our report card rolled around, this change had been made on platforms that we'd been advocating for years, and we're really proud to have been advocates for this change. But how effective was that policy? Again, no notification of whether or not a decision was made. Response within 24 hours varied. This is the type of work that we think is really important to expose some of the complicity that social media platforms have when individuals are being targeted or when messages are being rippled throughout platforms that are impacting other individuals. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now. These messages have a real impact. Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, other forms of hate absolutely have an impact both online and offline. A 2020 study focusing on millennials and Gen Z and their understanding of the Holocaust found that nearly 50% of US millennials and Gen Z have been exposed to Holocaust denial on social media. 67% of New York millennials and Gen Z had seen Nazi symbols on social media. So we're seeing this across the board, and we know that what happens online does not stay there. As Sami mentioned earlier, it starts with words. That really impacted me when you mentioned that, because that is absolutely what we see and where our concerns are. And as Jacqueline mentioned, the words can lead to atrocious, everlasting, and ever impacted violence and death. These hateful ideologies boomerang, whether it's in the dark web where we see a lot, our Center on Extremism tracks what's going on in those areas, but goes to mainstream social media, to the tops of our news feeds. And what happens, these words become normalized. People become completely unaffected by seeing these words, this form of abuse, this rhetoric online. And that's where we know that online and offline, that harm in the digital world and harm in the physical world absolutely have a connection. ADL has said we can look no further than the insurrection at our Capitol on January 6, 2021, which we called the deadliest terror attack in American history. The most predictable terror attack in American history, not the deadliest, the most predictable terror attack in American history, because it was planned and promoted on social media. Most predictable attack. We saw Camp Auschwitz shirts. We saw swastikas. We saw so much ugliness and hate and violence and bigotry that day. But a staggering statistic, according to ADL research, nearly 80% of individuals arrested for storming the Capitol were not card-carrying extremists. These were ordinary individuals who were motivated by misinformation and hate and violence most of which we would argue they probably saw on social media. Other attacks against the Jewish community and other communities that had a connection to online hate, think no further than Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, most recently, Colleyville. These attackers were influenced online and committed deadly or near deadly actions offline. According to the most recent FBI hate crime statistics of 2020, hate crime incidents targeting the Jewish community made up to nearly 55% of all religion-based hate crimes. So again, what we're seeing online, we're seeing offline. And sometimes I know we call online and offline the digital world and the real world, but what happens online is very real. And what happens in the physical world is very real. So we see that connection. We know that social media plays an incredibly significant role, but the question is, should we hold platforms accountable? And our answer is that platforms absolutely should be held accountable in many circumstances because they are amplifying and recommending this hate content and profiting off of it. The business model for social media is designed to keep people online for as long as possible, to sell as many advertisements as possible. The problem here is that the most engaging content tends to be misinformation, hate speech, and harassment. And so this content becomes completely unable to be looked away from, recommended to a ton of people, amplified, magnified across social media from platform to platform, and again, to the tops of our news feeds. And platforms are profiting off of it because we're staying online longer and we're watching more advertisements. One issue that I'll quickly touch on regarding platform liability, and this is a big discussion in the legal community, is why can't we hold platforms accountable when we know that this role that they're playing is so real? And that is because platforms have a really powerful liability shield in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 was passed in 1996 at the dawn of the internet, when there was a lot of hope and excitement, and the potential for what the internet could provide us was, the most consistent storyline. Well, a lot has changed since 1996, but that law immunized platforms for liability for nearly all third-party content. Anything anybody posted on platforms, they would not be held liable for. And it also immunized voluntary and good faith attempts to moderate content, which we think is a good thing. Unfortunately, this law has been very broadly interpreted. So regardless of knowledge, regardless of payment, if we're talking about advertisements, regardless of profit, algorithmic amplification, there is this shield from liability, and that means that there's less incentives for platforms to really put their billions of dollars in profit to better tune their AI, to have more content moderators, to take more time to invest in a safer and more equitable platform. ADL believes that Section 230 reform is necessary. We think it has to be done very carefully. There are a lot of proposals out there, and we want to ensure that there isn't an overcorrection and that there isn't too much that platforms are held liable for, because that could result in a change in our social media ecosystem where individuals who are marginalized or targeted may not be able to engage online. So again, this isn't something where we think that reform should be so much so that our internet completely changes, but absolutely we need to change incentive structures and systems. In addition to advocating for reform like that, which I'll mention, nearly 80% of Americans want platforms to have more accountability and believe that lawmakers need to increase that. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, we're looking across the country on laws that are impacting hate and harassment and an individual's access to justice. We're looking to increase transparency so that we know how we're being served, the content we're being served, so that dangerous algorithms that contribute to civil rights abuses and terrorist violence aren't happening on such a regular basis. It's not a single fix. We need a holistic approach, but online hate does lead to offline violence. Online hate does influence our communities. It does normalize extremism and bigotry, and we know that words can turn into genocide, and we need to stop that. So with that, I'll close my remarks, and thank you for having me here today.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And I wish we had more time because we could probably have a program just on online hate speech and social media platforms. So, you know, I thank you for your remarks and the work of the ADL on this issue. And I do want to note for everybody that we probably will go a few minutes beyond the 1:45 end time, just so everybody has a chance to make their remarks. And I hope that everybody can stay with us a few minutes beyond that. So I wanted to turn to you now, Owen. And Owen Pell is a retired partner of counsel with White & Case. He has represented governments, banks, and companies in complex cross-border disputes relating to the interaction of multiple legal systems, the extraterritorial reach of US law, and issues under international human rights law, including historical reparations. He has advised the US government on issues surrounding Holocaust looted art in Germany. He has handled major cases involving corporate social responsibility, including as to World War II and the Holocaust. Owen is the president of the board of the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. Thank you for being here with us today, Owen. And I'd like to commend you on your contribution to the report, Filling the Silence, which was sent to attendees before this event. And you know, I'd like to give you a chance to highlight some of your findings from that report, and also discuss the work of the Auschwitz Institute more generally in its efforts to prevent genocide and mass atrocities.
Thanks very much, Clayton. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I want to start by picking up on something that Sami said by turning back and looking a little bit at just a little bit of history. The idea of preventing genocide and mass atrocity crime beyond a vague dream can be drawn from Justice Robert Jackson's opening arguments at Nuremberg in November 1945. Jackson made clear that the fate of the individual defendants, or as he called them, 20-odd broken men, whose personal capacity for evil is forever past, was actually not the core issue. Jackson argued that what made the inquest significant is that these prisoners represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatreds or terrorism and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power. They are symbols of fierce nationalism and of militarism, of intrigue and war-making, which have embroiled Europe generation after generation. They have so identified themselves with these philosophies that they conceived and with the forces they directed that any tenderness to them is a victory and an encouragement to all the evils which attached to their names. Civilization can afford no compromise with the social forces which would gain renewed strength if we deal ambiguously or indecisively with the men in whom these forces now precariously survive. These are stirring words, but they proclaim something broader than a birth of international criminal law or a landmark in defining what could constitute genocide or mass atrocity crimes under international law. Justice Jackson inaugurated a new field of study with his opening remarks and a new set of guiding principles. First, Jackson was challenging us to understand that no genocide or mass atrocity crime is ever purely random or spontaneous. Rather, as ably documented before and during World War II by Raphael Lemkin, genocide and mass atrocity crimes are a direct result of social forces and political philosophies that drive specific types of hatred, the end result of which are the types of genocide and mass atrocity outbreaks that had scarred Europe multiple times over the centuries and with greater rapidity in the 65 years leading up to World War II. Second, Jackson was making an integral part of his case the idea that the Nuremberg defendants had conspired to pervert the German state for the purpose of unleashing the evil forces that had given us the Holocaust and myriad other crimes prosecuted at Nuremberg. Thus, the prosecution was going to examine more than the crimes committed after the war started in September 1939. Instead, there would be a study of the period beginning with the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923 to trace how the Nazi Party infected and overcame the German state and German civil society. Another nod to Lemkin, by the way, who in the mid-1930s referred to mass violence against ethnic and other groups as a form of social psychosis that would spread across borders if not contained. By studying the history of the entire Nazi period as part of making their case, the prosecution would begin mapping out the precursors to genocide and mass atrocity in ways that have in fact shaped the field of prevention. Third, Jackson was implying that more is at stake than the skin of the individual defendants. He was arguing instead that only by appreciating the processes by which these defendants corrupted the German people could we hope to end the wasting of one European generation after another. Jackson was positing the idea that recurrence could be prevented, that the cycles of genocide and mass atrocity crimes that had marred human history could in fact be broken. This crucial idea ultimately gave rise to what became the principles of transitional justice, which are central to the work of genocide and mass atrocity prevention. The Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities is the largest NGO in the world, working with governments on the design, implementation, and monitoring of programs to reduce the likelihood of genocide and mass atrocity outbreaks. Over the past 12 years, we have trained over 7,500 government officials from over 90 countries. We have created 3 regional networks in Latin and Central America, Southeastern Europe, and in the Great Lakes region of East Africa, and also have active informal networks in the European Union, West Africa, and the United States. Central to our work is using the Holocaust as a teaching tool in the work of prevention. As Sami and other speakers have recognized, one of the key characteristics of the Nuremberg defendants was that they were not crazy. Indeed, only one of the principal defendants was viewed by the US Army psychiatrists as truly psychopathic, and that was Jules Streicher, who was publisher of the rabid anti-Semitic Nazi newspaper and was nonetheless convicted and hanged, notwithstanding arguably being insane. Hence, a key aspect of the Holocaust was how ordinary people came to commit great, great evil. We use this as a teaching tool to help government officials understand how historical, social, economic, and cultural forces can work to convince people, including governments, that certain groups can and should be targeted, dehumanized, and ultimately destroyed. We also routinely involve civil society groups in our training programs so that government officials understand the importance of civil society and the value of civil society in building prevention. The Auschwitz Institute has conducted many hundreds of training programs over the years. And if you go to our website at www.auschwitzinstitute.org, you can plug into many of those. But I want to highlight 5 programs today as indicative of how the work of prevention keeps progressing from what Justice Jackson said at Nuremberg. First, I want to highlight our Global Lemkin Seminar, which is an introductory seminar for government officials who do not have a background in genocide and mass atrocity prevention. We conduct that seminar twice a year. We've been doing it online during the pandemic, but normally it is twice a year at Auschwitz-Birkenau for a full week. We take government officials to Auschwitz-Birkenau. We have a classroom about 100 yards from the gas chambers. And we conduct that seminar once in English and once entirely in Spanish because of our very active Latin American network. And we bring together government officials and members of civil society to see how working together is integral to building societies capable of preventing genocide and mass atrocity outbreaks. We have a US police training program that was developed in connection with the FBI after FBI officials attended our Global Lemkin Seminar. The US Police Training Seminar, among other things, uses the Holocaust as a teaching tool to try to get police officers and police leaders to understand how implicit prejudices and biases can affect their actions in how they police and interact with communities. The program has been very popular. It's been run online during the pandemic. It's already rolled out to over 950 police officers, and it is now mandatory in the city of Atlanta for all police leaders and police officers over the next few years to take our program. Security sector and police training reform in Latin America, Mexico, and Southeastern Europe. These are programs, again, very similar to the US police training program that are designed to help security forces understand how they are perceived in the communities they police or provide security for, and how history shapes how communities see them, and thereby shapes the relationship with security forces and police, and can influence whether their policing turns into a form of mass atrocity crime. We've had extensive programming in Kenya since 2008 that have dramatically reduced the scope and volume of electoral violence. And a groundbreaking report we wrote in connection with efforts in Kenya. Our groundbreaking report looked at every Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has ever been used. There have been over 55 of them. And what it looked at was what factors make a Truth and Reconciliation Commission successful, measuring success by whether you can see documentable data showing a reduction in the factors that we view as precursors to potential genocide and mass atrocity outbreaks. And that report was interesting. It was the first report of its kind that showed a link in the data, but also that began to lay out a blueprint for what makes for more successful transitional justice efforts. We've had a program that teaches Brazilian high school students how they as individuals can build more just and inclusive societies, which is now being included as mandatory curriculum in high schools across the 6 most populous states in Brazil. We are now adapting that program for use in other nations in Latin and Central America. And what's very interesting about that program is that in certain schools that had had very high rates of violence among students, our program seems to correlate with a strong drop in the rates of violence. And the students tell us it's because no one had ever explained to them that in controlling their own environments, they could make these types of choices. With regard to corporate engagement, you cited the report that was sent around to people attending the seminar. We were retained by the French National Railway to look at their Holocaust history and look at how their Holocaust history had been portrayed in US litigation and the US legislative process. And what it really was helping them understand how what they did in the 50 years after World War II in not addressing their Holocaust history made transitional justice much harder for them and for the communities of affected stakeholders who had been affected by their conduct during the war. And the report was an interesting discussion about corporate memory, that corporations do have memories, that corporations have ways of interconnecting with their memories, and that if corporations understand their history, it may change the effect, it may change the way they do business. And in changing the way they do business may change the way they affect the societies in which they operate. And we're hoping that this is the first kind of report this was the first report of its kind we've written. We've got other corporations that are now speaking to us about these kind of reports as we begin to engage more and more with companies in light of the European Union ESG framework that's rolling out now. Like I said, you can read about this and other reports that we've issued and other programs we've done on our website. In terms of impact, another way of looking at impact is how successful have we been in getting governments to actually implement this kind of program? Because when we started our work, there was very, very little genocide and mass atrocity prevention programming. Over the last 12 years, we've seen that for every dollar we now spend every year on designing and implementing training programs, governments that work with us are now spending over $74 million a year. So last year, the governments we work with have rolled out over $280 million in genocide and mass atrocity prevention programs. These programs are sowing the seeds of prevention, and we will keep at it to give truth to Justice Jackson's openings at Nuremberg. I also want to say, because of a couple of things that Sami said, it's worth noting in the neighborhood of prevention and memory preservation and transitional justice, there are 2 very interesting websites that the Claims Conference has been involved in. One of them is itstartedwithwords.org, which includes survivors telling their stories. It's a place where they collect Holocaust survivor stories, and the Claims Conference website explains about that. And there's also a very interesting website, again, part of a Claims Conference initiative, don'tbeabystander.org, which honors rescuers, which honors people who, as Sami was talking about, are not passive, but actually find ways in the face of great evil, to react in ways that save and preserve human life. So with that, I want to thank you again. I want to thank all the panelists for their wonderful presentations. Thank you for inviting me here today.
Owen, thank you so much for your remarks and for the work of the Auschwitz Institute. It's great to hear about those programs and really the concrete impact they're having in preventing genocides and mass atrocities. So thank you for that. I wanted to turn now to Rabbi Mark Wilds, who'll be our last speaker. And Rabbi Wilds, thank you for joining us today. Rabbi Wilds is the founder of the Manhattan Jewish Experience, a highly successful Jewish outreach and educational program that engages young Jewish men and women with Judaism and the Jewish community. He is the author of Beyond the Instant, Jewish Wisdom for Lasting Happiness in a Fast-Paced Social Media World, and the 40-Day Challenge, Daily Jewish Insights to Prepare for the High Holidays. Rabbi Wilds earned a BA in psychology from Yeshiva University, as well as ordination from Wrights, Yeshiva University's Rabbinical School, where he teaches an outreach course training new leaders for the future. Rabbi Wilds holds a law degree from the Cardozo School of Law and a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University, where he studied human rights and international law. Thank you for being here with us today, Rabbi Wilds. I wanted to give you a chance to discuss some of your own research that you've done in relation to the United States response to Kristallnacht. And it would be great to hear a bit about your organization and the work it does. And lastly, if you could just talk a bit about the importance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day to the Jewish community here in New York City, that would be great. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really, I consider it a great honor to participate in this very, very important event. And I thank you for including me in this virtual gathering. I'd like to begin with your permission. Can you hear me okay, Clayton? You're right? We're good? Okay. Okay, excellent. And I'm just so impressed with everyone who's been talking and sharing their experiences and their expertise. There's this story in the Bible describing the high priest Aaron, who was Moses' brother, when he confronted the tragic death of his own two sons. And the Bible tells us in Hebrew, it says, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. And the Jewish sages praise Aaron for his silence, because theologically, and I think a lot of faith systems believe this, that faith or silence, really, I would say, in the face of a great tragedy, the death of his own children, is viewed as a very positive thing, even meriting reward. And indeed, a silent acceptance of God's decree, particularly when it is a difficult and challenging one, is always seen really as almost a courageous act of faith. And in this sense, silence is indeed a virtue. But we all know that at times, silence could also be the most inappropriate response to tragedy. And there are times when remaining silent in the face of evil is not a virtue, of course, but could be considered criminal. And the Holocaust, I think, in the 20th century is probably the greatest example of this. The world may never forget, and all of you are doing an incredible job at making sure that nobody forgets the 6 million who perished in the camps. But we also have to make sure that we do not forget the hundreds of millions who watched and remained silent. And this is so important for what Jacqueline was speaking about before. And it's important, to review a little of the history, because dozens of governments and heads of states who had the opportunity to intervene, but would not sacrifice military, political, even economic support to save innocent Jewish lives. A terrible quota system that existed in this country that allowed only a handful of Jews into the United States. And I don't know how many of us are familiar about the two boats, the St. Louis and the Struma, filled with thousands of Jewish people that were turned back to Europe, where all the passengers of those ships ultimately perished. There are 23 documented letters sent by the United States ambassador to Germany. His name was George Wilson, and I feel like he's one of the unsung heroes during the Second World War. He was stationed in Germany in the late 1930s, and in the very short period between April 1938 and Kristallnacht, just a year later, November 1938, the same year, there were 23 letters he wrote to his boss, Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State. And those letters, basically, I'm going to go through some of them with you, detailed the implementation of the various Nuremberg racial laws to the Jewish citizens of Germany. He wrote about laws that required Jews to give up their government, Jews that were forced out of their professions and businesses. He wrote letter upon letter detailing these discriminations, including the night of Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, which he himself witnessed. And I was in graduate school, and for an assignment for class, we were supposed to analyze the diplomatic correspondence between an ambassador and a secretary of state. And I found these letters in the stacks in Columbia. And I remember telling my professor, Dr. Henry Krapf, that there wasn't much of a correspondence or a dialogue here for me to analyze. Because out of the 23 or so letters written by Wilson in this very short period of time, just a little more than a year, he received 3 letters back. And all those letters dealt only with how Wilson should deal with American Jews who happened to be situated in Germany at the time, completely ignoring the plight of German Jewry. But these letters are important in terms of what was known then by the State Department and by the Roosevelt administration. On April 30th, 1938, there was a telegram that Ambassador Wilson sent to Cordell Hull relating the contents of a decree issued by the German government, which said, and I quote, to declare, requiring Jews to, quote, declare the value of their entire domestic and foreign fortune. 2 weeks later, he wrote about another letter that all persons domiciled in Germany, including foreigners, must notify to the Reichsbank their liquid holdings and on demand dispose of such holdings to the Reichsbank. And he also mentioned Jewish industrial undertakings. And this is very personal to me because my grandfather, blessed memory, Max Schoenwalter, after whom I'm named, escaped Nazi Germany. He actually settled in Liechtenstein, neighboring Switzerland. My mother was born in Zurich. And they eventually came to the United States. And my grandfather had a paint company in Germany, which was taken from him. And we have a letter from his successor. Well, really the person who took the company, it's a euphemism. And the successor notes that the company is, quote, now pure Aryan. And the letter signed Heil Hitler. And this gentleman who took the company found it convenient to keep the name Schoenwalter & Co., which is kind of a Jewish name, to take advantage of the reputation, that the positive, very good reputation that my grandfather had built up in his many customers in Germany and the various Scandinavian countries where he did business. Now, getting back to Wilson's letters, Wilson described a series of large-scale series of arrests in Berlin. He told of an order by the Minister of Economics forbidding Jewish traders further access to German stock exchanges. It went on and on. Another report which compelled Jews to bear Jewish names. The law said that in, quote, cases where Jews do not bear those given names, designated as Jewish by the Ministry of the Interior, they'll be forced to adopt by January 1, 1938, the given name of Israel for a man or Sarah in the case of a woman. And I thought also, because this program is sponsored by the New York Bar, that I would also share that on October 38, in another letter, Wilson related 2 decrees which, quote, invalidated the license to practice law held by Jewish attorneys in the Old Reich and Austria. And this just went on and on. When he was there, Wilson was there on the night of Kristallnacht. And this is what he wrote to Cordell Hull. He said, he talked about the, quote, systematic breaking of Jewish-owned shop windows throughout the Reich, describing how so well organized of an event it was. And the United States government and its failure to act was more than disappointing. Even more disturbing, full disclosure, was the reaction by members of our own Jewish community, Jews in positions of authority and leadership who refrained from using their influence. Now, it would be unfair to compare perhaps the influence that Jewish people may have today in the United States that existed then. There was fear and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the 30s and 40s in America. And there was there was a concern on the part of prominent Jews that making too much noise about what was happening in Europe would worsen the situation for American Jews. David Wyman, in his famous book, The Abandonment of the Jews, describes how one of Roosevelt's primary Jewish advisors stopped Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, stopped Morgenthau from presenting the president with a plan to begin an administrative rescue policy for Europe's Jews. And of course, there were committees, the famous Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. When you want to make sure nobody's going to do anything, you start a committee. Over 30 countries were represented in this Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. Not one country volunteered to expand its quota to allow more in Jewish refugees. The only thing they discussed at their meetings was the feasibility of starting a Jewish colony for European Jewish refugees in some other parts of the world. Listen to the countries considered: Southern Ethiopia, Kenya, Haiti, Madagascar, Dominican Republic, all suggested and considered, despite the almost unanimous consensus by experts that such resettlement was completely unrealistic. And so for the years that Jews were permitted, and I would argue encouraged, by the Third Reich, Deborah Lipstadt was a Holocaust scholar and one of my mentors, agreed with this assessment, that for those years that Jews were encouraged by the Third Reich to leave Germany and German-occupied territory, there was simply nowhere for them to go. And I would like to just leave you with a story that came out not so long ago. I have it on my desk, but I don't want to leave the computer, so you'll just trust me. It was a story that appeared on the front page of the New York Times Sunday magazine section. And it was called My Dear Cousin Julius, Dear Cousin Max. It featured recently discovered wartime correspondence between two Jewish cousins, one in Germany, Max Scholl, and one in the United States, Julius Hess. And the German cousin, Max, is desperately trying to find a haven for himself and his family in the United States. He sends all these letters to his American cousin, Julian Hess, pleading with him to send him an affidavit so he could emigrate with his family to the United States. And that's what a lot of Jews were doing. My grandfather, who I mentioned earlier, Max Schoenwalter, when he got to the United States, that's all he was, the first year, he was just working affidavits, calling members of Congress to see who he could get out from his family and friends in Germany. And Max, going back to this Max Scholl in the story, finds a kind and sympathetic ear in his American cousin Julius. But Julius has to overcome all these hurdles that so many Jews encountered during those years, the incredibly restrictive immigration quota. In 1938, the same year as Kristallnacht, there were 220,000 visa applications at American consulates throughout Germany, 220 applications to come to America. The quota for Germany in that year was 27,370. And we still don't know why. In 1938, only 18,000 visas were ultimately issued. 220,000 people trying to get out, 18,000. And so Julius tried, like many others, to bring his cousin Max to the United States outside of the quota system. Julius was successful in securing Max a position as a chemistry professor in a local Charleston university, while writing his senator urging him to consider his cousin in the non-quota class. The consulate in Germany denied Max's application because they said he lacked the necessary 2 years teaching experience as a professor. Now, they decided that despite the fact that Max had a PhD in chemistry, he was an assistant professor at a high school in Munich. He taught chemistry and chemical technology in Switzerland for 8 months. For 20 years was the leader of laboratories in the chemical factory where he taught and supported many assistants. But they sent a denial to him and said, quote, "It'll be necessary to wait until his turn on the waiting list will be reached, which may not be for several years." So when Max learned the bad news, he tried to go and emigrate from Germany to England, but that was going to cost about 600 to 700 English pounds. Now, he was previously a very successful businessman. He had 150 people working for him in Milan, in Paris, and St. Paulo, but the Nazis by this time had forced Jews to give up their businesses, frozen their assets. He had no money. And he asked his cousin if he could borrow 300 of the pounds. Julius didn't have that kind of money. So he approached some other family members, cousins who were wealthier, a little reluctant though to help out. In a letter dated August 13th, 1939, Max in his broken English wrote, and I quote, "I cannot understand our cousins. When the things were opposite, I know we would do all in our powers to help in such great need. There are 4 human lives, it's him, his wife, and 2 children, near relations which are in such great danger, and they cannot feel with us. We are almost despairing. The long waiting has taken away our powers. I myself will and cannot believe that we are condemned to perish in that country. And we are innocents to our bad fate. We trust in our God and all of you, good men, that they will help us." Signed, Max. Julius waited a reply to his letter to the National Refugee Service, asking how they could send money safely to England. In the meantime, Germany invaded Poland. And on September 3rd, Britain declared war on Germany. They couldn't go to England. Max then wrote Julius informing him that they would need new plans. He heard it was possible to get to Chile, but that would also cost money. Quote, "It takes a lot of money, more than $400 for us each. I come to you to beg from all my heart to help us come to Chile." And Max said to his cousin that if they could not afford the 400 each member, then just send us enough for 2. We'll try to get the other 2 members out later. He concluded his October 23rd, 1939 letter with the words, quote, "It is the last possibility to save our life." Julius twisted a couple of arms, collected the money from his reluctant cousins. A couple of weeks later, January 1940, Julius gets a letter from the shipping company in Berlin telling him that the Scholl family, Max's family, had still not left Germany because Chile in the meantime had closed its borders. They were now being advised new immigration plans now to go to Paraguay or Brazil. Fast forward, Max somehow made it out of Germany to Yugoslavia. In a postcard, Max tells Julius how happy they were to have escaped. Quote, "Today we are very content having saved our lives, and you, my dear cousin, have made the great thing." But in February of the next year, 1941, Max's wife writes Julius without telling her husband, informing Julius of their dire financial situation and her fear that the war was going to come to the Balkans. Quote, "I'm asking you from the bottom of my heart to arrange affidavits for America. I beg you, please do not let my children perish. I know if my dear husband were in America, he would have already returned a portion of the money you have loaned us." And in that same month, Yugoslavia fell to the Nazis. And for the next 4 years, while the United States was at war with Germany, there were no more letters. There was only one last letter, which did not come until June 1, 1945, a month after the Germans surrendered. The letter was written by Max's daughter, because Max was no longer alive. 2 years earlier, as she described in the letter, Father Max Scholl was sent to Auschwitz, where the German secret police killed him after 3 months. And you just think about how many countries this one man knocked on, how many doors, how one person, one family could be turned down by so many people. The United States, England, Chile, and there were so many others who met with the same fate. And so when Hitler tried to compel Jews to leave Germany, in German occupied territory, nobody would take us in. And people want to know why Jews so desperately defend Israel and what would have been like if there was a state of Israel, when no other country in the world would increase their quotas or even offer us temporary safe haven. Hitler proved to himself and to the rest of the world that nobody really cared. There were, of course, individuals, Jews and non-Jews alike, people like Ambassador George Wilson, informing his country every step of the way, trying to do what he could. People within our own Jewish community like Julius Hess. But by and large, they were just individuals in a world which watched in silence as Hitler continued to the next phase and proceeded to implement his final solution. And so when the world commemorates, or just recently commemorated on International Holocaust Day, the Shoah, the Holocaust, and I'm sure many people were asking, and I'm sure many people will continue to ask, where was God? It's probably the most often asked question I get as a rabbi. I say it's a good question, but I also respond by asking my own, where was man? And I congratulate Owen, the incredible work that you're doing, and everyone who participated and is doing something and not just studying history, like I've been reviewing these last 15, 20 minutes. But the history is so incredibly important. You know, one of the great theologians of the 20th century, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, taught that instead of asking why bad things happen to good people, we should instead ask, what can we do? What can be learned from a difficult or painful experience, whether it's on the international level or it's a personal one? Since we can't really know why God allows the good to suffer, we should instead ask what we can learn. How can we somehow grow from this tragedy? We can still learn from this painful moment. And you had asked me, Clayton, just to mention something about, I've devoted the last 25 years of my life to reaching out, mostly to 20s and 30s living in the New York City tri-state area, to try to educate what has happened in our own time and how we can make a difference today in doing what we can to call out and to give expression to what is happening. We have to learn to speak out against all forms of injustice, never remain silent in the face of attempted or real actual genocide. We must ensure that whatever our differences, be they race, religion, or political persuasion, it may never prevent us from being there for each other. We are all God's children, created in his image. And we dwell together on a very, very small planet. We are our brother's keeper. And if we can take that from this program, and my esteemed predecessors who spoke before me, sharing incredible work that they're doing to make a difference and to learn the lessons of the Shoah, of never again. Because I truly believe this, that the way things get set up in this crazy world of ours, is that often we cannot only help ourselves, we have to rely on each other. The Jews were not able to save the other Jews, they needed others. And others going through genocidal, victims of genocide and the like, need those of us living in freedom to speak out and to make a difference. If we can remember this lesson, if we can continue to be our brother's keeper, if we can take that from this program this afternoon, and I think we will have learned something vital from the Holocaust, and we will have brought great honor to the memory of the 6 million. May their memory be a blessing. And I thank you for inviting me to share these words, and I thank you all for participating.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Wild, for those really moving remarks and providing a historical perspective, and relaying that through an individual story, which really brings it to life. So I commend you for that. I think that's a great place to end this program. I wish we had more time where we could continue to hear these illuminating remarks from all of our speakers, but unfortunately that brings us to the conclusion of this important event. I want to again thank all of the co-sponsors of the event for putting this event on, as well as extend my gratitude to the City Bar for all their support. I want to thank all of the attendees for being here today. And lastly, I wanted to extend a sincere thank you to all of our speakers who made this a truly special event. Your stories and the work that you do motivates us all to fight anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred in order to make the world a better place. So I want to thank you, and I hope that everybody has a wonderful afternoon and rest of their day. Thank you.